Hello, and welcome to the National Museum of the Pacific Wars webcast. My name is Lauren Cornegay-Dollar, and I am the Adult Programs Coordinator here at the museum. We are so glad you were able to join us today and hope that you really enjoy the presentation we have for you. Today's guest presenter is Jack Woodville London. Jack is a military historian and author who is Director Emeritus of Writing Education for the Military Writers Society of America. He is currently a postgraduate student at Rowley College, Oxford University. Jack has joined us today to share his research on Halsey's Typhoon. Jack, welcome to the program.
Thanks very much. It's nice to be here. I'm looking forward to it. We're going to talk today about something called Halsey's Typhoon. Halsey was Admiral William Bull Halsey, who was absolutely one of America's heroes in the war in the Pacific during 1940s World War II. He was an aircraft carrier man who one of the first people in the Navy to actually foresee the utility of aircraft carriers as offensive weapons. Until he came along, they were few and far between and were considered to be defensive weapons to keep an enemy's navy or landing force offshore. And he saw that the aircraft carrier could in fact be used for offense. When Pearl Harbor happened, he was in charge of the aircraft carrier Enterprise, and due to a small storm out in the Central Pacific, it delayed him by 1 day from being in Pearl Harbor when the Japanese struck on December the 7th, 1941. He was one of the most angry people about what he saw when he entered Pearl Harbor, and he vowed that he would use his carrier technology to lead the war and try to destroy every Japanese boat and airplane that had taken place in the raid. His first public recognition of heroism was only a few months later when he took the aircraft carrier right up to within the reaches of the mainland of Japan and led the Tokyo bombing raid of early 1942, the very first time in history that a foreign power had attacked the Japanese mainland and showed the Japanese that they were not invincible. He later was put in charge of the aircraft carriers and the fleet command of the Central South Pacific during the time when the Marines and the Army were fighting in Guadalcanal. Before he was in charge of that, there had been some terrible aircraft losses and ship losses in the Suvos Straits. Halsey put in new ideas of his own creation, attacked and defeated the Imperial Japanese Navy in the battles at Guadalcanal. By late 1944, Halsey was in charge of a large Third Fleet task group that was present off the west coast of the Philippines, off the east coast of the Philippines, in support of the Philippine landings where Douglas MacArthur had vowed, "I will come back." This was when MacArthur vowed he would come back. Now, 1944 had been a very good year for the Allies. If you'd start early in the year, you have the Fifth Army under Mark Clark moving right up the Italian peninsula. You have the invasion of France, June 6, 1944, the Allied landings in Normandy, and just a day or two later, the entry into Rome of Clark's forces, and not too long after that, the entry into southern France of the 36th Infantry Division. By October, the war in the Pacific had moved all the way up to the Philippines, and we experienced victory in the largest naval battle of World War II. Many say the largest naval battle in history. It was the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The remaining strength of the Japanese Navy had come through the San Juan Straits and was threatening to break out into the Pacific Ocean and attack the landing force from the rear. So in 1944, if the American public was reading the newspapers or listening to the news, they knew that the American and Allied forces were making great headway toward victory in World War II. Then came December. On the same day that we're about to discuss, the Battle of the Bulge broke out in Belgium. German Nazis and Allied forces clashed up and down a long region of previously undefended land. German forces bulged into Belgium. American and British forces were isolated and were heavily damaged. And in the Pacific, on the very same day, Admiral Halsey was found to have charged off in the wrong direction during the battle for Leyte Gulf, chasing a decoy fleet against his orders that led him to be out of position when MacArthur made his landings on Mindanao and Mindoro and in Leyte. So he was in a little bit of trouble. That's not quite the right word, but he was the subject of fleet communications. Where were you during the most important landing battle of the Pacific War to that point? Now, as it happens, as he was being discussed in Leyte Gulf, a series of weather observers began to notice a change in the weather pattern across what is now the Western Pacific east of the Philippines. In fact, in December, a very powerful typhoon began to form about 350 miles west. What is a typhoon? Most people would say it's a hurricane, but only in the Asian Pacific. It has 73 knot winds or greater. That's 90 miles an hour, and waves that are 46 feet or higher. Now, they did not have the weather radar that we have. They did not have satellites. They did not have balloons. Mostly they had temperature readings, pressure readings, wind readings, and aircraft spotting. And one man named Reed Bryson was an Army Air Corps captain who had been trained in meteorology at MIT. He was stationed on Saipan, even further to the east. He had been tracking this weather, and he marked the weather developing as a potential typhoon. He created a weather map, he predicted the strength of the path, and he warned the Navy Meteorological Office of the risk to a refueling task force located between Ulithi and the Philippines. He said, "I think there's a typhoon forming out there." Almost immediately, the Navy task force telegrammed him back and said, "We don't believe you." Bryson knew what he saw, but to be sure, he sent an airplane up. The airplane found the storm and flew into the eye of it and took a photograph. He sent this to the Navy Meteorological Office and said, "I sent an airplane up and here's what we saw." And they said, "Okay, but we still don't believe you, but we'll watch it." The airplane was so damaged by the storm that it had to be scrapped. Now, back to Admiral Halsey. In December 1944, Halsey was sent west from the Philippines to refuel his fleet. Task Force 38 was a pretty large fleet. It had 7 Essex-class fleet aircraft carriers. Those are large. It had 6 Independence-class light aircraft carriers. They're smaller aircraft carriers built on the chassis of cruisers. They don't have about half as many airplanes as the large carriers. He also had 8 battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, 11 light cruisers, and about 50 destroyers. Sure enough, several hundred miles east of the Philippines, the typhoon that Captain Bryson forecast developed right where Halsey was supposed to refuel. On Halsey's flagship was a gentleman named Costco. He estimated the morning of December 17 that the storm would be where my cursor is indicating. The refueling rendezvous was right here, and the task group was very close to that refueling rendezvous and to the path of the storm. As you can probably tell, it's not a good idea to try to refuel ships in the center of a typhoon. Costco told Halsey, "I think there's a typhoon in our path. Maybe we should track away from it to the north." Halsey said, "I don't think it's a typhoon. I don't think it will curve in our direction, and I'm going to keep on refueling," because Halsey, among other things, was already under orders to go back to the Philippines to support the land-based landings of MacArthur's troops. Here's what happens when he attempted to refuel. This is an attempt to refuel the aircraft carrier Lexington on December the 17th. The hoses run from ship to ship. The ships join hulls with only the ocean in between them, and they have to pump enough fuel from one ship to the other to enable it to refuel. The hoses kept breaking. After hours and hours, they finally agreed that they could not continue to refuel in the weather, but Halsey still refused to believe that it was a typhoon. The lines kept breaking off, the ships kept bringing together, and Halsey said, okay, let's give up for a little while. They sail away, but Halsey said, let's turn this way instead of this way. He sails off to the southwest, straight into the eye of the typhoon. The next day, he orders another attempt to refuel, but by then, all of the ships are rolling. A ship can roll pretty far. Upright is 0 roll. 45 degrees would be rolling that direction. 90 degrees would be that direction. Ships can typically roll up to 70 degrees and right themselves. Here's the problem. Many of the ships were so low on fuel they had no ballast. And Halsey kept his task force together, ordering them to steam on and to rendezvous right at the refueling point in the eye of the hurricane until he gave permission to the ship commanders to stop trying to refuel and to seek their own courses. The larger ships were somewhat able to ride this out. The smaller ships were the destroyers. Remember, there were 50 of them. The destroyers on this task force had spent days at full speed running up and down the flanks of the entire fleet, protecting them from any other aircraft that would come in, submarines that came in, or enemy fleets, none of which Halsey had found, but which had depleted the fuel on the destroyers. The destroyers were all top-heavy. That means they had a very shallow draw in the water. They were long and narrow, and they would roll over much faster and right much more slowly than one of the larger ships. The destroyers were the lowest on the fuel, so they had no weight in the bottom of the ships to help keep the bottoms low. Most of them had new commanders, because as a commander would gain experience, they would be promoted up to a higher level of ship. And unfortunately, their sailing orders were unclear. They were losing communication by radio with the fleet. Halsey's orders coming down to them were somewhat contrary to what the eyeballs were telling them was the safer course, and they were losing eye contact and radar contact. Worse, the destroyers began to list more than 70 degrees. That means that their sides of the ships were completely underwater before they would right themselves. And without any weight in the bottom, it took a very long time for them to roll back up. Among these were the USS Spence. Here we have a picture of the USS Spence attempting to refuel on the 17th. As you can tell, the waves are a little rough, but the big problem is it's so far away from the Spence that the refueling lines are just coming apart every time they try to connect them. The Spence was down to 15% of fuel and had 0 ballast. On the 18th, it got into one more position to attempt to refuel, and the ship listed so far over that seawater came down the stacks, went straight into the engine room, knocked out the engines, knocked out the electrical board, and knocked out the pumps. The Spence rolled over one time too many, went past 90 degrees, could not right itself, and the Spence sank. The Spence had 294 sailors on board. Only 23 survived. Another ship that was in trouble was the Hull. The Hull was an older destroyer. It had the narrowest of beams, and it was more top-heavy than before because it had just come out of refitting, where they had added 500 tons of new armament and top-heavy radar. The Hull was a pretty impressive ship. It had been at Pearl Harbor on the day of the battle. It had seen action in the Solomons, Guadalcanal. It had sailed completely across and north up to the Aleutians to prevent the Japanese from taking charge of the Aleutians. It had sailed back to the Marianas, and it was in the Leyte Gulf in the Philippines during the landings. It was an impressive ship. and only a few weeks before it changed commanders. Its new commander was named James Marks. His crew, unfortunately, did not have confidence in him and called him Jackass Marks. His nickname was well earned because during the storm, Marks was seen to huddle in a corner of the bridge, refuse advice from any of the senior commanders who had been through these before, and gave commands to steer the ship into a trough. The problem with steering a battleship, a destroyer into a trough, is when the waves are taller than the decks, it loses steerage and is in what is called being in irons. It cannot steer up or down the sides. All it can do is buffet with the waves. And sure enough, the hull rolled over and sank. It had 142 men on board. Only 62 survived. One of those was Marks. A third ship, a destroyer, that was in grave trouble was the USS Monaghan, another heroic ship. It had been present in the harbor at Pearl Harbor on the day the Japanese invaded. Its commander had thrown off the yoke of being lashed to the dock, steamed straight out of the harbor, and found a Japanese mini submarine and shelled it and killed it on the day of the Pearl Harbor attack. It, too, was a destroyer with a very narrow width, a narrow beam. It was very top-heavy. It had 12 battle stars and a heroic crew. But it was too low on ballast. When it lost its pumps, it could not move seawater into the pumps to ballast the ship and hold it upright. It crashed the pump valves, and the ship rolled too far and sank. 250 men on board. Only 6 survived. All in all, there were 790 sailors who were lost completely in the Halsey's Typhoon. The butcher's bill was pretty bad. We know that there were these 3 destroyers that sank. 8 other destroyers were damaged so badly that they were unfit for further service in combat, and one of these was a ship called the Tabrer. This is the USS Tabrer. It did not sink during the Typhoon, but you can see that it took a considerable amount of damage. Its stacks are broken. Its aft carriage is all under demolition. And the Tabrer also had a new commander. The Tabrer, however, disregarded Halsey's orders to steam in and to break off and find its own most convenient path out of the storm. It went on a search and water rescue in the middle of the night of December the 18th. The men on the hull, the Monaghan, and the Spence mostly clung to what is called a water rope. It's a large floating net with floats on it. There were 2 rafts, and the Tabrer went around looking for these water nets and looking for these rafts. About half of the men who had gotten into the rafts and half of the men who had held onto the water nets simply turned loose and died. Some tried to drink the seawater and went crazy and died. Some tried to swim from one water net to the next water net, and they were attacked by sharks. There was water on board the little rafts, and they had emergency supplies. The men reported that they opened Spam rations. As soon as they did, the sharks came. They threw the Spam in the water, and the next day opened them again. They smelled the sharks, the smell of the Spam. They came back. The men had to ditch all of their rations. The Tabrer rescued 55 men out of the water. It is the only ship that rescued anyone until the seas calmed down 2 days later. How bad was Halsey's Typhoon? As I said, the Spence sank, lost all but 23 of its crew of 294. The hull sank, lost all of its crew except for 62. The Monaghan sank, lost all but 6 of its crew. And on board other ships, 104 men were washed overboard. Many of these were killed within the confines of the ship due to exploding boilers or on the aircraft carriers. The airplanes would get loose, bang around the hangars. 27 of his entire fleet, of Halsey's fleet, required repairs before they could return to action. And as for the aircraft carriers, they lost 146 airplanes, washed overboard or destroyed inside the hangars. Turns out to have been the third most destructive battle for the U.S. Navy in the Pacific War. This was a battle against everyone except the Japanese. What is the aftermath of this? The Navy Court of Inquiry was convened very quickly to find out what had gone haywire. Admiral Nimitz, among others, convened and supervised the court, and they found that Halsey had in fact disregarded weather advice and sailed straight into the storm, but they absolved him of negligence, saying he only made errors in judgment under the stress of war, trying to make combat obligations back in the Philippines. The same court also blamed the skippers of the 3 destroyers who sank, saying they attempted to keep their stations far too long. Nimitz wrote that the wise course of a ship commander is to save your ship before it's impossible to recover. And that brings us to the next thing that happened in Admiral Halsey's career. In June of 1945, Admiral Halsey had another fleet. He sailed it directly into another Typhoon. The USS Hornet and USS Bennington were damaged in that Typhoon so badly that the front 24 feet of their flight decks broke off in the waves. A heavy cruiser named the Pittsburgh lost the forward 110 feet of her bow. It broke completely away. And 29 other ships sustained storm damage that ranged from moderate to severe. They lost another 100 fleet aircraft, but thankfully, unlike Cobra, no ships were lost and only 7 men died. That's the tragic story of Typhoon Cobra, also known as Halsey's Typhoon. Halsey defended his action, saying that first, at Leyte Gulf, he had taken a prudent action, not running away from the battle, but looking for a fleet that everyone believed was there, but simply did not exist. It wasn't his fault that he missed MacArthur's return. As for Cobra, he said he was holding station because he needed to get back to the battle. And as for Connie, he blamed the weather forecasters. That is the story of Halsey's Typhoon.
Thank you so much, Jack, for your presentation on Halsey's Typhoon. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions before we let you go. So first question is, what prompted you to research Halsey's Typhoon? Do you have a personal connection to the story, or is it just an interest that grabbed you and wouldn't let go?
I think the worst thing about being an author is promoting yourself, and I hate to do it. But in 2018, 2019, and 2020, I wrote a novel called Shades of the Deep Blue Sea, in which a fairly rascally group of sailors encounters that typhoon in the Central Pacific and wash up far, far, far away in the islands of Palau. What took me there was that I discovered that at the end of the war, there was a Japanese prisoner of war camp called Ambon that was one of the most violent prisoner of war camps in the entire Pacific theater. Ambon prisoner of war camp was formed after an Australian task force named Gulf Force went to try to recapture West New Guinea, was captured. And within 3 days, the Japanese had manually beheaded and shot every member of the task force. That POW camp grew to a very large size over the next few years, and at the end of the war, I discovered that 3 Americans were in that POW camp. All of them had come from Halsey's Typhoon. That formed the basis of a novel, which in turn formed the basis of the research. So the answer to your question, and please feel free to edit my answer, is the destructive force of the Typhoon was among the greatest in American naval battle history, and yet 3 sailors appear to have washed away from it and survived a float in some way of over 1,000 miles to wind up in a Japanese POW camp.
Okay. So my next question is, were typhoons common in the area, or did Halsey just happen upon two of them and was a little unlucky?
Both. Typhoons in the Western Pacific, off the Philippines, off China, off Vietnam, off Korea. There's a typhoon in process as we speak today. Are seasonal, just as our hurricane season in the Atlantic and in the Caribbean are seasonal. The typhoon season there is very similar to our typhoon season. December is part of it. So it's very common in that part of the world for typhoons to form and to form in that area and in December. The luck part of it was that weather forecasters did not have the tools we have today. They had weather balloons, they had temperatures, they had winds aloft, they had airplane sightings, and they had barometric pressures. And the war was so widespread that there were very few weather forecasters who had data from everywhere. This fellow Bryson was one of the most advanced trained weather forecasters that there were, and he barely cobbled together enough information to find the typhoon in the first place. The bad luck was that because of its location, Halsey simply didn't believe him. When the typhoon formed where it did, Halsey felt so strongly about having missed the first battle that he wasn't going to miss the next battle. So he turned into what ordinarily they would have believed to be the safest path, but by bad luck turned to be the worst path. Does that help?
Yes. So it seems like there was a little bit of bad luck and then a little bit of wanting to be present and not miss because he missed out on the other one.
I think that's true. Yes.
Is there something you wish more people knew or understood about Halsey?
There is no such thing as a black and white history, and to fully blame Halsey is difficult. And there's great disagreement among naval historians about whether he should accept the blame for this. I think when you're a sailor below decks or when you're an Army officer on the ground and things are happening fast, it's always easiest to blame the commanders above you for getting you in that place and not getting you out. Halsey was a very experienced commander. He was a very aggressive fighter. He was a justifiably honored hero. And to blame him for what turned out to be in the wrong place at the wrong time is a little harsh. But that is also is the fortune of war. You know, with great power comes great responsibility. I think that the lesson we should learn from that is that you cannot control Mother Nature, but you should do everything you can to conceivably preclude Mother Nature from controlling you. Halsey did not.
Okay. Before we let you go, I want to say one more thank you for sharing your presentation and your research on Halsey's Typhoon. And I want to say thank you to our at-home audience for joining us today. As many of you know, the National Museum of the Pacific War has a fairly large collection of both 2D and 3D artifacts. Contained in this collection are several pieces related to Halsey's Typhoon. For example, we have some copies of letters, drawings, and a film reel. I just wanted to let you guys know that we have those pieces in our collection. And I also want to say one more thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.